Hi, my name is Brandi. Today I'll be conducting an interview with Spinifex Press publisher and author Susan Hawthorne on her book, Lesbian: Politics, Culture, Existence. So, as I was reading over your collection of essays, I was wondering, how exactly did you start writing?
You mean historically? Is
In
that what you mean?
general, like what drew
In
you
general?
into being an author?
Um, well, I think I started writing really after deciding to be a lesbian. I joined the women's liberation movement. I'd had a relationship with a man for a few years, but as soon as I joined the women's liberation movement, like within months, basically that all ended, and I came out as a lesbian, and that was in 1974. And it was after that that I started writing. I didn't write a huge amount initially, but the first essay in my book, Lesbian, which is this one here, is from the long piece that I first wrote in 1976. And I wrote about the institution of heterosexuality. I wrote about lesbian feminism as a strategy, and as well as that, I wrote about rape and romantic love and a whole lot of other things. So that was really my first very substantial piece of writing, although obviously I had written essays previously. But I then, over the next decade or so, I began to write more and more. I wrote a journal daily for a long time. I still do, but it's not as frequent that I write. And so gradually I just started writing, and I did a lot of book reviewing for a while. I wrote a lot of short stories, wrote some poetry, and in the early 80s, I started writing my first novel, The Falling Woman. And it's nothing like writing a novel to give you practice in writing, because novels are, they're pretty long. They don't have to be long, but even short novels are substantial pieces of work. And so, I guess I got to practice by doing that. And I then started working as an editor at Penguin Books in Australia. I started to learn the professional side of things. And then in 1991, Renate Klein and I founded Spinifex Press. And we've been running that ever since. And so we are the publishers. We also are editors. We have another editor, Pauline Hopkins, who is our senior editor, and really we would have trouble doing it all without her. So, over the years, I've written lots of different things, and it took me a while to consider myself a writer. And I think particularly lots of women find that quite a hard transition unless they've, already decided at a very young age. I did try to write a novel when I was 9, but I only got halfway down the first page. That wasn't a good start. But it was obviously there in my head.
I think it's interesting. And I've noticed that a lot of topics, a lot of feminist books or essays in the past couple of years either seem to have this required groveling before they can actually say anything feminist, especially if they're from a larger publisher. I've read a couple books that were something like an analysis of Mr. Darcy and romance. And of course, they had to have a little section that goes, well, it's just cis men. It's not the other kind of men. And this novel, this book includes trans women. And even when it comes to discussions on gender, sexuality in other contexts, I feel like there's just always this pause before we can actually get to the heart of it, because we have to stop and say, wait, I'm not the bad kind of feminist. I'm the palatable kind, I'm the fun kind. And it's interesting that I've read a couple books from your publisher, and it's very refreshing to not have that prerequisite before you start getting into the nitty gritty.
Yeah, well, I mean, I actually think that feminism is a joyful movement, and I think that being a lesbian is probably the most joyful thing I have ever done in my life. You know, I mean, it changed my life enormously, and I think that lesbian culture is very, very important in terms of that, and we're seeing a real demolition of that at the moment. As lesbians, as the word, even the word lesbian, you know, is a word that a lot of women don't want to use anymore. And you know, lesbian is a wonderful word. On the back of my book, I have the word lesbian in a whole lot of different languages down the side. And I wanted to be able to do something like that because the whole idea of being a lesbian is not only exciting and joyful, but very important politically.
I saw that in your collection, you wrote that the word lesbian is a powerful word. So, what are your thoughts on the shifting definition of lesbian and woman, particularly in Western and liberal spaces?
Well, I think I'm very troubled by the fact that nobody wants to use the word lesbian, and you know, you fill in a form and it says, how do you identify? Do you identify as LGBTIQ plus, etc.? And I want to scrub it out and say, I am a lesbian. I'm not that whole alphabet soup. I'm not anything other than L. I'm not BGTQ, etc. And I find it troubling that that whole alphabet name has actually written us off, even though L is at the beginning, because by the time people get to the end, they've forgotten about the L. And as well as that, the idea that one can be a cluster of identities is problematic in its own way. I mean, it just isn't possible. So, and I think it's going well outside of Western countries now. Certainly, I think, you know, Western countries is where this has been generated. But I see a lot of things happening coming out of countries outside of the so-called Western zone, and the big trans organisations are doing their best to colonise other continents. I read the newsletter from Australia, which used to be a lesbian-centred organisation to raise funds for lesbians. And now the word lesbian, it does get mentioned because it's part of, you know, their history, but it is certainly not a priority. And they are doing a lot of things in other countries. The most recent one I saw, Africa was at the top of the list, then Asia, then Latin America. So clearly they are working very hard. And Eastern Europe is the other cluster of countries that they are working to transform away from the word lesbian and the culture of lesbians.
You know, I'm living currently in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, and it's interesting because there is a gay culture here. There's pretty, in the city at least, it's pretty accepting. There's a lot of gay clubs. There's a lot of places that you can go to, and you can be pretty open. At my workplace, it's kind of funny. Sometimes they don't know how to refer to me as male or female because part of it is that in the language here, there is no he, she pronouns. There is one pronoun, goat, which you can use to refer to he, she, it. Instead of pronouns, what we do is they use positions in the family. So if I'm talking to someone older than me, I would refer to them as bong, or someone younger than me, I refer to them as Owen, which basically means older or younger sibling. So then when I go on Tinder or I go to a meetup and I meet a Khmer person and they're like, my pronouns are he, they. You don't even have pronouns in your in your culture, in your language. I can tell that you spent a lot of time online, and the internet is a very colonized Western space to have come to that conclusion. And then when you ask
Yeah.
about that, well, what does that mean in context? I mean, you're a woman who likes women, right? So they completely shut down. And I think it's
Mm.
quite interesting that you noted about lesbian culture that we should not assume that our generation is the first to invent a culture for ourselves. But I kind of fear that every generation of women kind of reinvents the wheel when it comes to women's liberation, when it comes to lesbian culture, because there's a lack of communication or connection with the previous generation, especially when it comes to writings. I mean, if you look at any feminist writer or thinker, by the next generation, she's being called too rigid or too strict, or she was racist, or there's something that was wrong with her that we have to completely throw away everything she said. And yet, of course, we're still teaching all of the great Greek philosophers, even though many of them supported slavery. It seems like there's a very big double standard there.
Many of them were indeed slavers. They were the people who owned slaves, you know. So yes, and it is extremely problematic. The other interesting book that I know of is Giti Tadani's book Sakiyani, which is about a kind of lesbian history of India. And she goes back and she looks at, you know, a whole range of different things happening 2000 years ago, and she traces a whole lot of other things through that time. And we are told, she says, I am told that when I talk about lesbians, I'm being colonized by the West. I'm just going along with what the West wants. But when you see a man in India wearing a suit and going about his business work, nobody talks about that as colonization. So yes, there are two very different things going on, depending on whether you are a man or a woman.
Do you think that, in addition to the disconnect between generations and a lack of sort of in-person spaces, do you think that the problem of a lack of lasting lesbian or feminist culture is getting worse or better? I mean, do you think the internet, which admittedly does connect a lot of the world, makes it worse or better in continuing to uphold lesbian culture and activism?
I think it's a mixed bag. It does make us easier to stay in touch with one another depending on where we are. In say, you know, the 19th century or even the early 20th century, it was hard to meet other lesbians, particularly if you happen to live in a rural area. Almost any rural area anywhere in the world, then it was hard to meet. And so these days, because the word lesbian, in spite of the fact that nobody wants to use it, is actually recognized more readily. I didn't know what a lesbian was until my mid-teens, and you know, that was because I went to an all-girls school. Somebody informed me. But until then, I had no idea that there was such a concept as lesbian. And that's the case for earlier periods, unless you happen to live in a city or a big town of some kind, or happen to be part of the upper class, then it was possible for the idea of lesbian to be part of it. But the general run-of-the-mill women who we are, we would not have. So I think certainly the internet has made it easier, and there's a lot more work around written by and for lesbians now. But there's also a lot of books, say, from the 1930s, what you would call the modernist period. Those women writers wrote the most incredible stuff, and nearly all of them were lesbians. But that is hardly ever talked about. Diane Suhami wrote a great book a couple of years ago called No Modernism Without Lesbians. And she goes through all the different writers and talks about their work and the fact that actually, because they were lesbians and they were independent, most of them were well off, not all of them, they were able to do things differently. They were able to break new ground. And I think that's one thing that lesbians do very well. I think we do break a lot of new ground. We invent new ways of saying things. We invent, over the years, we've invented many codes for lesbians. And so that's, I think, you know, it's another whole part of it. So I think it's a mixed bag. I think we more in touch with one another, but there are whole areas that are left out.
Yeah, I do think that I'm lucky in that I'm on social media. I have Discord servers, and I've met lesbians and bisexual women from around the world. And I travel quite often, and I'm lucky in that regard that I've been able to meet many of my internet friends in person. But it is very
Mhm.
frustrating knowing that, for example, here in the city, there is a men's only hotel and spa. There are men's only clubs. There's, you know, the gay clubs, but they're for anybody and they have the drag shows. So plenty of tourists just come to see that. There aren't really any dedicated in-person spaces to meet other like-minded women, which is somewhat frustrating. But I guess it's a trade-off that I'm at least able to know and put a label onto my experience to seek out similar minded people. But I've also noticed that the internet has led to this change in the feminist movement, especially in Western areas. And you noticed this in 1991, where you wrote that feminists and lesbians were defending and promulgating violence, sadomasochism, and commercialized sexual gratification. And that's even more common now, I would argue, than it was back in the 90s.
Yes, I think it is, and but that has gone through all those periods, and because there is so much pornography on the internet, and because there is because that is readily accessible, really, by almost anyone. It doesn't matter how old you are or whatever. That I think has generated much more really problematic relationship styles, let's call it. And there's a book that I refer to, the SM Safety Manual, in my book Lesbian, and it's got the most horrendous stuff in it about how you should treat other lesbians if you're in an SM relationship. So so there's all of that, but there's also just this kind of acceptance that of an individualized whatever you want to do is okay. So if you want to go out and, you know, dress up in ways that are really insulting to women, that's all right. You can do it because that's your thing. And, you know, much worse happens. You want to do trans story time. There's a big thing about that in Australia in the libraries. And, you know, the most progressive people think that's perfectly okay. I don't, because I don't think that's useful in terms of children who have great trouble distinguishing between reality and unreality. I'm not against, you know, having, you know, funny books and animals talking and, you know, that sort of thing. But it's a scale of difference there. Very different indeed.
Yeah, I've noticed the drag story time thing. It's popular in the US too. And on one hand, there's no problem with adults dressing up in silly, bright costumes to read to children. The issue comes from presenting that as representation of gay, because a lot of people do not view LGBT as separate things. It's just one lump thing. It's all gay. So one bad thing reflects badly on the rest of us. And
Mm.
then it's often super sexualized, which children just don't need to see. And then on top of all of that is the misinformation,
Mm.
telling children that you can be of a different sex if you just really think so. Well, when I was a kid, I thought I was a vampire for like a solid year. My parents did not let me get fangs implanted, thankfully. But like, can you imagine if a child has that power?
Mm, mm. Well, yes, I have a friend who said that her granddaughter identifies as a unicorn. So does that mean that she should go off and have a horn implanted in her forehead? No, it doesn't mean that. It just means that she's going through a particular time in her life And, you know, that's perfectly all right for her to dream and imagine and all of that. That's a very different matter.
2001, you wrote Transgender People in the Women's Circus, and it was very prophetic considering how we have forced inclusion in women's spaces from rape shelters to personal dating pools. And obviously, that's the year I was born, so I don't have any insight to that era. But was this conclusion obvious back then? Did you ever imagine things would end up the way they are today?
I didn't imagine they'd get so bad, but it was really clear to me that this was a colonizing move on the part of men. I had worked in Aboriginal education in the years preceding this, as well as in publishing. And, you know, it's really, when you see colonizing happening and you see it right in front of your face, and then you see something similar happening, but in a different context, it becomes really obvious. So to me, it was absolutely clear. And I used as an example, you know, if the word that is used by Aboriginal people in Melbourne, and this was in Melbourne, is Koori. So I said, if I decided I wanted to be a Koori, and I maybe made my face a bit darker, but how dark should it be? And decide I would go along to some Koori group and say, hey, look, welcome me in, I'm Koori. Well, you know, the thing is that in an Aboriginal community, they would say, so who are your relatives? Where do you come from? Where are your connections to the community? You know, they would not just let any old person, no matter how nice they were, and be able to say that they were a Koori. And I thought it was absolutely clear that that was exactly the same that was happening in terms of men wanting to be in the women's circus. And the women's circus had been set up for women who had been victims of sexual assault. I mean, that was the first thing. So somehow women who had had, you know, very bad sexual assaults perpetrated on them were meant to be nice to some man. You know, it's for me, it's beyond belief. And there's a lot of touch, there's a lot of intimacy in circus. You don't do that with just any old person who wants to come in because they think it might be fun. It doesn't increase the level of trust.
I used to volunteer at a rape shelter back in Georgia when I was living in the US as a sexual assault response team coordinator. And personally, I really loved that position because of how impactful it was. You go home every day and yes, you're tired, but you know that you made a difference. And what I noticed is, you know, working in that charity, there was one male staff member. He was a gay man, and he was very understanding of the fact that some victims would not want him to be there to be their support during a rape kit, essentially. And there was a difference, I think, in the sympathizing with the group. You know, I can sympathize with Cambodian women. I'm not Cambodian. I love this country. I love where I work, but I don't have the same experience as a Cambodian woman, but I can sympathize. And I think there's a difference between those people who are able to say, I'm not a woman, but I sympathize with women and still keep their space and respect. And that kind of attitude is somewhat, well, not somewhat, it is completely lacking in trans spaces today, I would say.
The respect for boundaries is really non-existent. And that was the other thing about the circus, that you had to be over 18 to join the circus, and you had to live in the state of Victoria. And my question was, how much more difficult is it to see the boundary between women and men? You know, so there are boundaries already set. So let's just have another one. And, you know, that isn't what happened. And a lot of us left the circus.
So I noticed that you also pointed out the issues with intersectionality, queer politics, and gender studies. And I feel like all three of those have been committing a sustained attack against women's boundaries, basically giving the leverage for people who are in the oppressed group, whatever that might be, to force their way in because any kind of exclusion is automatically bad. like the misinterpretation of intersectionality, which the term itself was invented by Kimberly Crenshaw, a Black woman, to specifically talk about how being Black and female creates this experience. And I feel like a lot of people are misusing intersectionality just as a way to pry open spaces. Have you noticed that changing over the years, getting worse, or?
I think yes, it has definitely gotten worse, and it's like the word has been weaponized. And in the chapter in which I write about intersectionality, I also talk about the difference between gender studies and women's studies, and the problem of gender mainstreaming, and all of those things all kind of happened at about the same time. And intersectionality, it's like, it's like the diversity person in the organization. The diversity person, one person usually, is meant to deal with all sorts of differences that people have and put forward ideas and so, and that's ridiculous. I mean, my PhD, which I put out as a book called Wild Politics, actually has a lot of stuff in it about diversity. And in there, I also said, I thought that it was probably going to be a problem, and that the idea of diversity would be appropriated at some stage. I also saw that the World Bank was already appropriating the term biodiversity. So I could see the shifts that were happening. So it's interesting. Those who don't want society change are very good at appropriating. They appropriate, and then they distort it in some way, and then they generally sell it back to the next generation. And often they make you pay for it as well, with money. So it's not something that is just done out of the goodness of people's hearts. Definitely not.
I think it's especially frustrating because of the progress that this type of takeover has received when it comes to women's issues, particularly. If you look at transracialism, for example, there's been a few high-profile cases of people saying, I really like Japanese food, so I'm Japanese now, or I injected melanin and I have weave, so now I'm Black. And they very much receive pushback of, no, you cannot co-opt an experience you've never had. It's not just skin level, it's not just skin deep. But then when it comes to women's issues, well, the guy's wearing a dress and has long hair, so good enough to be a woman, right? And I think that's kind of representative though.
Yeah, I mean, it's really clear that being a woman, I mean, if you have long hair and you wear a dress and you paint your fingernails and you totter around on high heels, that's seen as being a woman. That's what we fought against. In the 1970s, we really, really fought against those sorts of things. And we have had some success. A lot of women now wear flat shoes and no stockings. They might not seem like much, but that's a really big shift. And yeah, so there's a whole lot of things in there that have changed and shifted, but the oppression of women continues. So there's also the whole, appropriation of disability that goes on. That's another thing where people try to add, I'm disabled, I'm a woman, I'm a trans man, say, I'm from a particular culture, I'm this, I'm that. And, so you win what's called the oppression Olympics. Doesn't make you a better person. And nor does it make you very smart in terms of your politics. In fact, it makes you appropriating.
I like to call that a victim economy, because
that's very good.
In the past, I would say the past 10, 15 years, there's been this push to, okay, let's try to not be bigoted. Let's try to be open-minded with minorities. Let's try to work towards equality. But the pressure to do that, okay, we're listening to Black voices now. That's easily monetized. People get money from going to colleges and universities to give speeches. They get paid money to make appearances at events. So it's very profitable to be the most victimized victim. And then you get hired based on those labels, not based on any specific trait or ability, which is very frustrating because especially when it comes to disability. Women who are disabled are at so high risk of abuse. And not to mention just the lack of research into problems that women specifically face because of their health. There are so many ways that you can look at the intersection of woman and disability and see we need to have more attention on this, but then instead you have a spokesperson of a trans-identified male talking about period products. You have a trans-identified male heading the rape shelter or talking about endometriosis, or every single article that comes out now cannot say women are at risk of cervical cancer. It's people with cervixes, which is also very frustrating because in my job, most of my coworkers have English as a second language or very minimal English. Trying to explain my type 1 diabetes to them was basically impossible because of a lack of overlapping language. When you're learning a new language, you're not learning the medical terms. Even women who are just, first language English speakers do not always know what a cervix is. We're not taught that in schools. And it's just very frustrating to see. We have made a lot of progress, but it always seems like once there's a wave of progress from feminism, there's a pushback, and each time there's a pushback, it's always insidious. It's never meant to be as obvious as get back in the kitchen. It's instead, we're taking the word woman from you. We're taking your ability to describe your experiences from you.
Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it, that when you come to something like women's sport or women in sport, it's perfectly all right for men to participate because they say they're women. And then to mean that the women who are very good sportswomen miss out on things like the sponsorships, the scholarships, the writers miss out on prizes. I mean, a whole lot of different workplaces work against actual women, because the men come in and pretend that they are women and they run off with the honey jar. And that means that those women who would otherwise have had a scholarship or a prize and been able to move forward in some way, they miss out and they don't get any of it.
And I know that it's very difficult to stand up and say this stuff in public with your face, with your name. I run a YouTube channel where I talk about this stuff pretty openly. I talk about it openly all the time, but that's also because I'm lucky that I live in a country where no one knows what the hell gender identity is. Transphobia is not a thing here. No one's going to care if at my job at the animal shelter, if I don't call this guy and address a woman, but a lot of women don't have that privilege. But I also feel like what solution is there to these kind of problems besides talking about it, dealing with the short-term punishment and hoping to push through to the other side? Do you have any idea of a way to go against these issues?
Well, I guess I'll see over the next few months what happens to me. It's not as though I've been silent on the subject, but probably not that many people outside of the world of feminism and radical feminism would actually have heard me or know what I'm on about. But this book, it's far more public, and I have actually written a piece for a left-wing magazine, so that'll come out in a few weeks' time. So I'll see what happens. I am expecting some pushback. We have at Spinifex, we've published a lot of books that are critical against the trans ideology, and the main response to us on that has been just to not review the books and just stay away and kill us by ignoring us, which hasn't worked actually, because we've got bigger audiences amongst those who agree with us, and so I think there does come a time. I mean, I'm now 72, and I think, well, somebody doesn't like me, so what? I'll get through it. I will probably get upset if somebody does something really nasty, but I expect that some of that will happen. But I know enough other women in the same position who've moves straight through that and comes out through the other side. And I would expect that I would try to do the same. And we'll see what happens, really.
I think what it comes down to is pluralistic ignorance, because there's a very loud minority that likes to talk and yell and say, there's no difference between man and woman, it's all in your head. Like to argue these things. And a lot of people just, aren't on the internet, so that you don't hear their perspectives on it. Here, I mean, their internet's still here in Cambodia, but it's mostly Facebook, it's mostly look at my ad. Nobody's spending our entire day arguing on Twitter over stupid stuff. And then the other part of it is that a lot of people just want to keep quiet with all these laws about what you can and can't say on Twitter, especially in Australia, the recent turn saying that women are basically undefinable. I think that the more that we get books like this out there, the more there are articles, the more that we have videos and interviews and people saying, I don't believe in this. Women are a definable class that you cannot just decide to identify into. I think we're going to see a tide turning. I think it's turning now. My main concern, though, is just that a lot of people who are waking up to it are continuing to lump feminism and homosexuality into the same umbrella as those crazy transgender weirdos.
Yes. And I think that is very problematic. And I think the Greens Party in Australia is very, very pro-trans. And I've noticed that actually the trans movement is not at all au fait with ecology. And I really worry that the way in which the trans has poisoned lesbian and feminist, the perspectives that other people have of lesbians and of feminists will in the end have a similar kind of effect on the environmental movement, who are so pro-trans that there are many women in different countries around the world who say, there's nobody to vote for anymore. You don't want to vote for the right wing because you disagree with all of their policies and arguments. You don't want to vote for the Greens because they're so pro-trans, and you don't want to vote anymore either, maybe for Labor, who is probably the better of them, but who is umming and ahhing and saying, oh well, maybe a woman is a woman, maybe they aren't. And the recent decision, legal decision about the giggle versus tickle, or rather the tickle versus giggle case, is just ridiculous. That this judge thinks that you can change sex, that sex is an unstable category. Well, no, actually, there are men and there are women, and that's it.